We get to spend on a monthly basis a little time with Twin Falls County Prosecuting Attorney Grant Loebs, and he's joining us today for our December visit. And first of all, welcome back to our program.
Good to be here.
Got a lot to talk about today, and I think a lot of folks are. I know when Steve's here next week, he's going to have a lot of legislative guests on because there are two or three big issues that get a lot of attention every legislative session. However, there are a lot of things that take place that get debated, and sometimes laws get passed and signed by the governor that have a huge impact on the criminal justice system. And I was curious to know if there's anything that you're looking forward to or that you think is coming up in Boise that's going to have an impact.
Well, tell you my feeling about the legislature, and no disrespect to the individual legislators, because first of all, I think in Magic Valley we're lucky to have some of the best ones in the state. And I don't just say that because they're local. I say that because I look at the positions they take on things, especially things that are important to law enforcement. But my feeling about the legislature is kind of based on the doctor's oath, the Hippocratic oath, is that is do no harm. Just don't screw anything up. There are so many phony reform ideas out there for criminal justice that are tempting because somebody will say, oh, I see that South Dakota did it, or Iowa did it, or Ohio did something, or New Jersey's one of the popular ones to imitate. And of course, when you think about it, we don't want to imitate those states in any other way. Why would we think that they have good ideas on criminal justice reform? But there are some bad ideas floating around out there. The Supreme Court actually is working on a very bad idea, which will limit the ability of victims and witnesses to identify their assailants. Um, Based on some pseudoscience that comes largely from the East Coast. I think New Jersey is one of the main, ones on that, and groups like ACLU push that stuff out. Um, that's scary, and I hope that they don't do that. I hope that they don't destroy our civil forfeiture rule, which allows the confiscation of the means and the profits from drug sales, the means to do drug sales and the profits that drug dealers get from drug sales.
Well, this has become a nationwide movement, but you've
Right.
explained in the past that we don't have the abuses they have in Oklahoma, for
Well, we don't have the
instance.
ability to abuse the way they do in Oklahoma because, and again, Ohio is another one of these, because our statute is very narrow. I mean, you have to be charged with a crime in order for anything to be seized.
Mhm.
Anything that is seized goes before a judge, and you can have a jury trial to fight to oppose the seizure of the item. So there's always a judicial determination with proof provided by both sides, and almost every time there's a criminal conviction. But the civil case and the criminal case go separately for some very good reasons, which I think we've discussed before. Because if you do them in the criminal case, then what happens is you have people who um, agree to plead guilty to save their new Camaro, or they agree to give up their new Camaro to get out of a guilty plea. And that shouldn't be the way it is. I mean, it should stand on its own. If you're not guilty, you shouldn't plead guilty so that you can save your stuff. Um, and obviously, we don't want people pleading guilty who aren't guilty just because there's a financial burden because they might lose something. So it's a bad reform, a bad idea, and if the legislature follows up on that, they will take from law enforcement a valuable tool, put in the hands of criminals the fruits of their illegal labors, and the loser, of course, is the average citizen whose law enforcement will be less robust and whose criminals will be more empowered. So that's a bad thing, and hopefully that doesn't happen. Um, the Freedom Foundation, among others, is proposing a broad, sweeping legalization of marijuana, which will be a bad idea. And
We've
I know,
touched on that, I
I know
guess.
you've taken some heat for your position on that, but this bill goes well beyond anything that's been up before, and hopefully they don't even find a sponsor for that. This would allow you to possess what is now trafficking amounts of marijuana under the guise of using it for your own personal medical use or dispensing it to people for medical purposes. It's clearly just a legalization of marijuana for a recreational use bill, and we've seen from neighboring states how badly that goes. So that's a bad thing. And then, but in terms of proactive rather than just reactive, I think that there are some changes that need to be made to so-called reforms that we've made in the past couple of years, which I think have contributed to, I can't say they're solely responsible for, but have contributed to the increase in crime that we have in the state, the increase in violent crime that we have in the state. And we've seen some of these cases right here in Twin Falls where people are being released from parole. Um, Earlier than they would have before, and without, you know, in my opinion, due consideration for their lengthy violent histories, because in part the current case that they're in on is categorized as a nonviolent crime. So if I am in prison because I've been distributing, methamphetamine to somebody, that's classified as a nonviolent crime. But if my previous record involves robberies and rapes and shooting at policemen, I'm still classified as a nonviolent criminal because of my current charge. That's a bad idea, and I think we need to just continue as Idaho always has in treating each case and each individual as an individual rather than try to overlay some kind of matrix that has worked in some other state or maybe has failed in some other state. So, the legislative session is always it's always a lot of variety, and I do sympathize with the legislators having to deal with some of these issues. I mean, they're not experts in these things, and it's very difficult to become an expert because a bill was introduced this year and you sat through some hearings. Um, but like I said, we have good legislators in our area that we can rely on to put forward, the good position on these things.
Our guest is Grant Loebs. He's the Twin Falls County prosecuting attorney. We're at 9:14, almost 9:14, and 28. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Now, your office handles criminal matters, but there was a story that Cato Institute picked up out of Idaho about about civil courts where in English common law, it used to be if you were the loser, oftentimes if you bring a frivolous lawsuit, you had to pay the other person's expenses. And Cato says Alaska is the only state in the union currently doing it, but Idaho is potentially moving in that direction.
Well, yeah, there's a case that indicates that we are. There is currently a situation in Idaho where if the case is frivolous, you can be assessed costs. And there are often people who request attorney's fees because of the frivolous filing on the other side that just unjustly wasted money of your client. This movement is a little more aggressive than that and looks toward the possibility of making essentially the loser pay. Um, and there are arguments on both sides of that. The argument in favor of it, obviously, is that you know the system is less burdened. There will be fewer people filing lawsuits that have little chance of winning. There will be fewer frivolous lawsuits just to harass people because you'll have to pay sometimes a substantial amount of money because once you force a person to hire an attorney and go through court and hearings and motions and writing briefs, that's a lot of money. So on the one hand, reduces the number of cases, reduces the frivolity of the cases. On the other hand, though, the argument against it is that there might be some legitimate cases that just need to be brought. There might be some people who um, have unique claims who you don't want to silence by having their lawyer say, we haven't heard this in Idaho before. You could win and you could be a landmark case, or you could lose and you'd have to pay $100,000 in attorney's fees. And then people say, well, I can't afford to do that. I guess I'll just give up. So there is some fear that it chills the ability of people to bring legitimate but not sure thing lawsuits. So we'll see how it works out.
And the decision was 3-2, I guess, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so it was very close among the judges when they decided it.
Right.
That
And it still doesn't require, it's still not a straight out loser pays thing. It gives the local judges discretion, greater discretion than they had before to decide, yeah, we're going to make the loser pay on this, rather than it's not a certain thing.
We have a caller with us, and we're coming up on 9:17. Grant Loebs is our guest in the studio this morning, our Twin Falls County prosecuting attorney. It is 27, and caller, you're up next on KLIX.
Good morning, Mr. Loebs. Don't you think that new law that says the loser has got to pay for the legal bills and all that other fun stuff, isn't that kind of like for the minimum wage earner? Suppose he gets sued, and attorneys charge $250 an hour. So it's like if he loses, isn't that tilted? That law is tilted to people that have more money. I would like for you to answer that question because I think it's the bite of that law. Thank you.
Well, yeah, sure. Like I said, if you have a client who has a potentially just claim, but can't risk the possibility of losing, then they're going to be chilled from pursuing that claim. I don't know that a wealthy client is going to be any more excited about losing and paying huge amounts of legal fees either, but obviously it will have a greater effect on a client who doesn't have the funds to do that.
Right, and that it take you a long time to pay off those legal bills afterward, if that's the case, right?
Right. Yep.
That's I think the argument. Coming up on 9:18, and of course Grant Loebs is our studio guest. He's here until 10 o'clock this morning, and we'll be taking more of your telephone calls as well. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And if you'd like to reach us after the break, the telephone number is 736-0300. That's 736-0300. And I'd just like to make a quick mention as well about our friends at Waddell and Reed here in Twin Falls. They've been in business now almost 80 years, since 1937. That's if you're looking for an investment firm, one that's been in business for 8 decades is likely one that you can trust. It's one of the oldest firms offering mutual funds, and they do something very rare. They offer more than one. And they're not going to throw your money away as if it's a casino. They're going to try and invest in tried and true strategies that will help you in the long run have some money for the day when you decide to retire, or perhaps you're sending your children off to college. And they do this because they work with you because of your unique personality. Everyone has different needs and wants. And remember, Waddell and Reed in Twin Falls, they take planning personally. We've got a short break coming up, but more with the prosecuting attorney in just a moment, and more of your telephone calls as well coming up in just a short while. Bill Colley with you on Top Story as well. We want to mention it's 28 right now. We're looking for a high near 40 before the day is over, but that may be the warmest day until sometime before the new year. Joining us in studio, Twin Falls County Prosecutor Grant Loebs, and of course we're taking your telephone calls as well. Bill Colley with you too on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Got a quick question for you. We had a couple of stories. One I think was out of Blaine County involving high school students, and then I know you can't speak case specifically about things that happen in Twin Falls County, but we've got a story that's percolating in one of our local school districts. We've had these stories, and maybe it's just anecdotal, and maybe it seems like it's happening more frequently because geographically they were close and they were both reported close in time. But are we seeing more crimes involving middle schoolers and high schoolers involving a violent sexual nature than we've seen before?
Um, it's hard to say. There are so few that if you have one pop up, then it's more than you had in a while. But it's not terribly rare. It's just that in these two instances specifically, they got reported somehow in the press. It would often be the case that these would be handled in the juvenile court system,
Mm-hmm.
which is almost always all but closed to the public, and that the investigations themselves would be fairly quiet because, you know, people don't want these things publicized usually. Neither victims nor obviously defendants want them publicized. So it's, I would say, yeah, it's true that this last year we've had slightly more than usual because these are a couple of big cases and there have been a couple of others. But it's not a rare thing. It's not like, it's not call out a special unit because we haven't seen this before. I mean, we've prosecuted these things over the years, you know, on again, off again. I mean, some years we have two or three, some years we don't have any, but it's certainly the case up in Dietrich, and um, catches people's attention because of the dramatic
The
and
graphic
disturbing
nature of
nature
it.
of it. Yeah.
Right. I
But
just
often those wouldn't, and that one I think involved one adult and one 17-year-old, and so that one became public because one of the people was a full adult,
18.
right?
Right.
And so that proceeds through the adult criminal system. But if it had just been juveniles, then probably you would hear almost nothing about it because it would be in a sealed case in juvenile court.
See, I don't know that I've seen any evidence of this, but I hear people talk anecdotally about some of the things young people now see on the internet. And there's concern, I think, that that encourages sometimes behavior that you wouldn't see because children might see something and then they're going to act out. But I guess there's no actual evidence to back that up.
Well, it makes sense, right? I mean, that's what you think it makes sense. But we've had the internet um, in one manifestation of or another for 20 some years now, and while there is a lot of bad stuff available on the internet, and kids see that, and they're either disturbed by it or they act it out or it affects them in some way. Um, but I think that that's a component of it, but I mean, we were all kids once. We know that they were bad kids when we were kids. We all knew who they were. We had heard things they had done. I think that depending upon the age that we're talking about, there's just an element of bullying and meanness and, you know, having no limits on their actions that you have with children. And then when you get the older children, then it becomes really a bigger problem because of the strength and the ability to carry out even more atrocious acts. But I don't think it's anything new. I think that in the case in Dietrich, we just were allowed to see it because it was not a juvenile case. Even as a prosecutor in this district, I would not have known much or anything about the case in Dietrich if it had been a juvenile case, unless I had, asked my fellow prosecutor up there what's going on, and he said, "Man, we got a bad case." It wouldn't be something that even people in the business would know about because of the way juvenile court proceedings are handled.
I think back though that when my parents were growing up, the only mass media they had was the newspaper, Saturday Evening Post, and radio, and I suppose they were bullying people then, but and we didn't have the extended media reporting on all of this too. I'm sure, but it just seems that maybe we have mythologized that time period, and when we see something happen today, it alarms us, and we say, well, we need to demand action, and maybe the action is just simply let it take its course through the justice system.
I think that's the only action you can take. I mean, unless you want to get, pitchforks and torches and, burn somebody out. I mean, I don't know what other action there is. I mean, you could be against the internet, against allowing kids to have cell phones, and against, mandatory adult controls on media that comes over computers. But I don't think any of that's going to happen. And I think, there is always um, first of all, you forget, and secondly, you romanticize the past. But I think if you really search your mind, and I think if some of my listeners out there search their minds about some of the stuff that went on when they were
Mhm.
kids, they would think of some pretty disturbing stuff. I mean, my father grew up in a small farm community, and some of the stories he tells me, I mean, this hair on the back of my neck raises, and I say, "Oh my God, how could you live in that?" It's been there forever. People Misbehavior of people is something that keeps the criminal justice system flourishing.
Well, we got to go back to Cain and Abel, I guess, and realize
Sure.
it's been going on a very, very long time.
Yeah. But that's of course not an excuse to look the other way or excuse it. I mean, we try to stay on top of it as much as we can, and when there are things going on that you know that you, any of your listeners think need investigation, certainly call the police. If your children have been victims of bullying or of any inappropriate contact, call the police. I mean, one thing that is true, we have a lot better ability to deal with these things, to address them through intervention by the law enforcement agencies and treatment and various other things. So the response by law enforcement has certainly improved over the years.
We've got more with Grant Loebs coming up in just a moment. It's 9:30 and it's 29. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I'm going to pick up on that comment about pitchforks and torches because somebody made an excellent statement about that last week in court. Our studio guest, Grant Loebs, is the Twin Falls County prosecuting attorney. It's 9:33. It's 29. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And, of course, if you'd also like to speak to the prosecutor today, telephone number 736-0300. That's 736-0300. Last week, saw a story in the newspaper where Judge Bevan, at sentencing for a young man who let his road rage emotions take over, and to a degree, to the point where there was nearly some serious violence that came out of this, and it could have been a lot worse than it was. Judge Bevan, I guess, according to what I read in the newspaper, did something highly unusual in court, and that is he warned that we might be dancing on the precipice when it comes to some of our actions, and he thinks we're seeing more and more of this in this country. You referenced pitchforks and torches, that we've reached a boiling point, I guess was the words that were used.
Yeah, well, we're certainly seeing more of that than we used to. And I think the case, of course, my office prosecuted that case, and with regard to judges, like with regard to legislators, I mean, we are always happy when we have a judge who follows our recommendation and does what we want him to do in a case. And on this particular one, Judge Bevan did follow what we recommended he do in that case. And then he added an editorial comment, which I think he's seen several of the cases in Twin Falls that have involved some sort of ethnic or racial conflict, and which has resulted in violence. And I think that's specifically what he was talking about. This was a case where the defendant assaulted a person, and then while he was assaulting them with a knife, yelled at them to go back to their country. Of course, not having any idea what country they were from or whether they were native-born Americans, just that they looked different. And so I think that his warning was based on having seen several of these cases, and I've prosecuted a couple of those in his courtroom as well. A couple of years ago, we had one where a man assaulted a woman in the Walmart because she was wearing a Muslim head treatment, whatever it's called, a burqa or something. I don't know if it was a full-on burqa, but it was obviously a indicative of Muslim heritage, and she was just standing there minding her own business. So I think what he meant is what President Bush said right after 9/11, and of course President Obama pushed it even farther. And that is we can't get to the point where we judge people based on what their last name is or what clothing they wear or what color their skin is. That shouldn't blind us to being able to judge people by their behavior. And we have a situation, obviously internationally, and with terrorism, and there are two new incidents from yesterday that caused people to be on edge. But you can't let that turn you into a criminal who violates the rights of people just because they look different. And I think that's what Judge Bevan was talking about, and I certainly support that.
Somebody told me not long ago that they have a son who plays on the soccer team at Canyon Ridge High School, and says, you could probably have about 6 different languages spoken on the field at any one time. And it's just the nature of this community, because of the growth, I guess, has changed so dramatically.
Right.
That people, it's a shock at first, but it's going to take some getting used to, I would imagine, by a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, and Twin Falls and Idaho in general is becoming a more inclusive, more diverse place just because populations increase and populations are mobile. And as some people have pointed out, we have obviously refugees coming in here, and to the extent that those refugees are bad actors and are criminals, I'm happy to prosecute them to the extent that they're minding their own business and trying to get jobs and become Americans. I applaud them. So you just can't get to the point where you paint everybody with one brush. And obviously, there are significant security concerns that our federal government needs to address about, who is coming into this country because some of the people that come in want to get a truck and drive through, a Christmas fair.
But I just, when you referenced the Walmart story, somebody grabbed a hat off my head in a restaurant many years ago, slapped it on their head, and started prancing around. And I remember how infuriated I was, and this notion that you're going to knock headgear off of people because you don't like their looks does seem to me that we've gone a little bit overboard on this.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's the result of some legitimate fears, some insecurity, watching the news and seeing bad things happen, feeling resentment about that, and then just not having enough of a filter to realize that, you know, there's no justification for attacking a person who's not doing anything wrong. So, I don't know that it's going to stop anytime soon, but I think the judge was trying to say, I've seen it, I'm not liking what I see, and we're going to start dealing with it seriously.
We've got more with prosecuting attorney Grant Loebs coming up in just a moment. It's 20 minutes from 10 o'clock. We've got 30 on our way to 40 today. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and News Radio 1310.com. Our studio guest is prosecuting attorney Grant Loebs. He's joining us in the studio until 10 o'clock this morning. If you've got a question or comment, a telephone number to reach us is 736-0300. 736-0300. It's 30. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story. Just a quick note. I had sent you something, I think, last night, and you mentioned you didn't get a chance to get through it because I was a little late. Everything else I'd sent along some clippings earlier. But there was a story by a fellow named Richard Berman, opinion column in the Washington Times. And he's citing some research where people are now claiming, and you talked a little bit earlier, we sometimes get scientific research, and even if it conflicts, people tend to go with the research they want to go with versus everything else that's out there. And he was saying that if you've only had 5 hours of sleep a night, you can be on the road and be just as dangerous as a drunk driver. And I guess what he's suggesting is that we should start applying similar laws to people who aren't getting enough sleep and then getting behind the wheel, which I don't know how you would actually prove
I can't
anything.
imagine how you would prove that. With truckers, of course, you have some restrictions. They have to have so many hours on and so many hours off. Doesn't prove they're sleeping during those hours off, but that's the idea. And they have to have a logbook that shows what they've been doing. I don't think that you could do that with Joe Citizen who's getting in the car to drive to see grandma for Christmas. Um, you can, the police can pull somebody over, of course, who's, swerving and appears either impaired through alcohol or drugs or sleep deprivation. But once you get a sleepy person out of the car to do field sobriety tests in 20 below weather, he's going to wake up right quick. So I don't know that you're going to be able to prove that they were sleepy. We've all been sleepy while driving, I think, without exception. I mean, I can't imagine anybody who hasn't felt at some point over a long haul drive, I should pull over. I'm getting a little sleepy.
By the time you get to Mountain Home, if you're on your way to Boise, you
Yeah.
generally realize it.
Sometimes just because of the boredom of the drive. But yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, if you haven't had enough sleep, but I don't know how you could measure that in a way that law enforcement could apply a standard. Um, but yeah, certainly drowsy driving is a dangerous thing, and anybody who's been drowsy while driving, you pull off and you get a cup of coffee, or you slap yourself with some cold water, and you say, "Wow, I shouldn't have been driving the last couple minutes. I was really tired." So, but I don't know that you can um, make it illegal in a way that the law enforcement officer can detect, lack of sleep. We don't have any way to monitor that. I have to correct a thing I said earlier. When I was talking about the Freedom Foundation marijuana initiative, I confused my pro marijuana legalization activists because that was the huge amounts are for the petition that's going around. The Freedom Foundation amounts are lower, still, by law enforcement standards, very large, but a lot lower than the trafficking amounts that the petition wants. And that petition, of course, is another thing that gets on legislators' radars. But I wanted to make sure that I don't confuse my marijuana activists.
Hey,
You know,
because they're not very
well, one
quiet
could call in
people.
and say I'm not nearly as radical a pro marijuana activist as you painted me to be. I'm less active a pro marijuana activist, and I don't want to be unfair to the moderately pro
They're
marijuana
such
activists.
shrinking violets, too. 946, Grant Loebs is our guest on KLIX, and we have a caller with us. Caller, you're on the air. All right, I'll give the number out again, 736-0300, 736-0300. The other day, there was a video I caught on the news about a man who had a stroke behind the wheel of a car, and this is where I think the sleeping argument gets a little bit ridiculous because the fellow in his car, he drove off the road. People probably were assuming he was drunk, and then he clipped a utility pole, took that out before he finally crashed the car in a culvert. And that's when people realized that this man was having some sort of a seizure or a stroke. I guess the argument would be similar. What are you going to do? Convict somebody because maybe they didn't eat right for the last 40 years before having a stroke and therefore shouldn't have been driving? It seems to me the whole sleeping argument would be about that ridiculous.
Yeah. I think that when you get behind a car, I mean, the main thing is whatever your issue is, whether it's prescription medications or, you've been smoking a joint or you are drinking or you're sleepy, just realize that you're getting behind the wheel of a vehicle that, if not handled properly, can kill people, including yourself and your loved ones. So, making excuses for what you can do to skate by just barely is not a good idea. And if you're driving and you're in a hurry to get somewhere and you feel yourself sleepy, still pull over. There's no reason to continue driving.
This time of year, traditionally we think about, speaking of people though who shouldn't be driving, this is the time of year because of the holiday parties. We tend to believe people would be drinking and driving more, but is there any evidence that really at Christmas time that we see more of it than, let's say, other times of the year?
Well, there's more enforcement. So, we see more because, in part, police are out looking for it more. People go to more parties, they stay out late, and you have a lot of amateur drinkers who, aren't used to drinking so much, who go to Christmas parties, go to New Year's parties, and wouldn't normally drink as much as they drink there, and they're not used to the effect, and so a lot of them get in the car and drive. So I think it's a combination of both. We see we find what we're looking for often, and there's more of it because the season, has a lot of people drinking who wouldn't be drinking. Uh, and there are several times, Fourth of July, St. Patrick's Day, New Year's, and various Christmas parties. All of those things are times when people are drinking who normally don't drink.
We had talked earlier about how culturally the violence we think we often see from children today was likely there 40, 50, 60, 500 years ago. When it comes to drinking and driving, though, I'm going to guess that we see a lot less of it this time of year than we likely did 35 or 40 years ago, just because the message seems to have, at least I'm of the opinion, maybe because I'm not out doing it, but I'm of the opinion we don't see it like we did just a few decades ago, that maybe people have gotten the idea finally.
Well, I think there's more stigma to it. And so I think 20, 30 years ago, and maybe before that, it used to be kind of, cute that somebody was drunk and people didn't pay that much attention to the fact that they, after being funny drunk, got in their car and drove away. I think there's a lot more attention paid to it now, and there's a lot more um, stigma with getting in the car drunk. I don't think if somebody tells you, man, I got home last night and I was barely able to see the line in the middle of the road. I'm lucky I got home. I don't think anybody thinks, wow, you're cool. I think people think you could have killed people. And I think there's been a lot of education and, a lot of publicized incidents where people who are drunk do horrible damage. So I think that's part of it. I don't know if people drink less or more now than then, but it's
My own
certainly something to
experience
be avoided.
My own experience at a Christmas party just this past Friday was I was drinking iced tea and I looked down the table and I noticed a lot of other people drinking iced tea. Where I went to, I came across an old picture from a Christmas party I went to in 1987. I knew where I was working at the time, so I know the year. And I can remember that at that particular Christmas party, there was a lot more imbibing going on with alcohol, and it just seems that I don't see that any longer in these
It could
situations.
be. I mean, in part, it could be responsibility, and in part, it could be fear that they're actually going to get arrested because there's certainly a lot more of that than there used to be, and the consequences are higher than they used to be. I mean, the policeman, you know, generation ago would take you home and, make sure you got in the house safely and say, no, just don't come out and do that again. But now you go straight to jail. So it's a big difference.
We have a caller with us. Caller, you're up next. You're on KLIX with prosecuting attorney Grant Loebs.
Hi. I was calling because I was curious about a call I made to the police and saw the individual taken into custody, and I was curious if it was a stroke or a drinking problem. And the guy was driving down Blue Lakes about Filer, and he was driving a little bit into oncoming traffic, but about 5 miles an hour. And I called 911. They took him into custody about Thursday night. So I never heard whatever happened to him, and I was just curious, and I didn't know if Grant knew anything about it.
I don't know about that particular case. And, it might never have reached me. The Blue Lakes is in the city of Twin Falls jurisdiction, and misdemeanor crimes, which a drunk driving would usually be, unless it was a multiple offense. I mean, the third or fourth offense uh, would be handled by the city prosecutor. So I wouldn't know probably whichever way that turned out. But it doesn't sound good. I mean, it sounds like somebody who shouldn't have been driving one way or another for sure.
I want to thank the caller for chiming in as well. We opened the hour today talking about what could happen in the state legislature, dealing and how it could impact criminal prosecutions and the like. Yesterday we had another string of pardons at the federal level and commutations of sentences. Are we looking at anything from the federal government in the coming legislative session that could have a huge impact on how we prosecute criminal cases?
Well, so much of that is up in the air now. Had Hillary Clinton won and had the Senate changed to the Democrats rather than Republicans, there was I think, would have been a huge move toward some of this criminal justice reform that I was talking about before. There are a whole slew of proposals that criminal justice reformers are advocating, and I think would definitely have been on the front burner had the election turned out differently. It's hard to say with Trump. On the one hand, he's picked Jeff Sessions to be his attorney general, who is against all of these things, who is pretty hard line, pro law enforcement, um, pro criminal prosecution. And then on the other hand, I read a story the other day, not knowing how valid it was, that the president-elect is considering Raul Labrador for something because he likes what he says about criminal justice reform. So I don't know. I mean, Raul Labrador's comments about criminal justice reform could not be farther away from Jeff Sessions. So I don't have any idea what to expect from the Trump administration because it seems to be on both sides of so many issues. But certainly the selection of Sessions indicates a turn toward um, a harder line on prosecution, a harder line on drug crimes, a harder line on marijuana legalization, a harder line on immigration prosecutions, on gun crime prosecutions. So we'll just see how that works.
My only thoughts on Labrador's meeting with the president elect was this: the day before, everyone was saying Kathy McMorris Rogers was going to be Secretary of the Interior. The day after Labrador met with the president-elect, the choice was Ryan Zinke, and it made me wonder if perhaps that was the conversation wound around to that, and maybe Congressman Labrador says, no, 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 this is the guy you want, not her. We will never know, likely, but there was a quick change all of a sudden.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like reading bones, shaking bones and seeing how they lay out on the ground to predict the future, to try to figure out what's going on in these meetings that Trump is having. I mean, on the one hand, he meets with all kinds of legitimate people and, comes out of the tower saying, this is my pick for this or my pick for that. On the other hand, he's meeting with Kanye West and, Al Gore. I mean, I don't know what to make of any of it. I think he's in the position of everybody on the planet wants to meet with him, and some of the meetings he takes for either political reasons or informational reasons, or actually he's serious about somebody for a position. And to try to guess which is pretty tough.
I think what he's doing is analogous to what hockey players do when they make a head feint to throw off the opposition, and a lot of this is done to throw off the media. And Randy Staples had a theory yesterday that that's the discussion about our own governor, is that he would be Secretary of Agriculture, as this might be another one of those feints while they go with another choice. Although it's, again, as you say, who knows? I mean, it's
and I'm sure that Governor Otter, given his experience in federal government and state government, and from an agricultural state, would have all the ability that you would need to run that department. But I don't know that I have no idea who else would be in the running, and I just don't guess anymore. I mean, I can't, you get so caught up in this, who's going to be Secretary of State? Is it going to be Mitt Romney? Is it going to be this guy? Is it going to be that guy? And then it's a guy you've probably never heard of. So I just watch and.
Yeah, my thoughts were the governor at least would know potatoes and ranching. So
he's been a congressman, so he knows how the federal government works, and hopefully, as governor of the state of Idaho, he knows more than just the crops that he plants and that he worked with in industry, because you do have to know from north to south everything that happens in the state, and it's an agricultural state. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see.
We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We'll be seeing you
Merry Christmas to you too, and
third Tuesday in January.
Yeah.
Which
everybody out there, be careful. Don't drive drowsy.
Yes.
Because that can happen at those long Christmas parties too.
Yes, it certainly can. We've got a short break coming up with Fox News at 10 o'clock, followed by the Rush Limbaugh program next on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 32. Bill Colley with you and saying have a great day. God willing, if the creek don't rise, I'll be back tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock.